Welcome to our sixth episode of Season 1 of Polarizing Conversations. Season 1 is supported by Inspiring Communities. Today we have the honor of being joined by Aatif Baskanderi. He is the CEO of the Northpine Foundation, a startup philanthropic foundation supporting ventures to achieve scalable outcomes for underserved and underinvested communities in Canada. Their starting portfolios include refugees, formerly incarcerated persons, the areas of Scarborough, rural and remote Newfoundland and Labrador, as well as climate, carbon, and nature as priority. Northpine deploys around $40 million annually through gifts, grants, loans, equity, and other hybrid means, and more importantly, aims to build deep relationships with its portfolio organizations as they pursue their ventures. He is also the co-founder of Salaam B'y, an award-winning documentary and anti-racism education initiative. And when I had the chance to chat with him, he had sent me the link to watch this documentary. And if you have the chance to watch it, I highly recommend it. His previous work spans multiple angles, leading innovation across sectors and communities. His educational background includes engineering, social policy, and technology management. And when we discuss the episode, so I always meet with guests to discuss what a guiding question could be. And we landed on the question of how might you be a Muslim Canadian? And we have the chance to have Aatif join us during Ramadan. So I'm looking forward to having this discussion today. So Aatif, how might you be a Muslim Canadian?
Thanks so much for having me, Vanessa. I guess how might I be a Muslim Canadian right now is I'm hungry. But no, aside from that, this is a question that obviously I've navigated my entire life. Being born in Sarnia, Ontario, and moving to Newfoundland, Labrador when I was 5 years old, and then since then, kind of like traveling around the world. It's been interesting to navigate this question of kind of like the existential question that lots of people ask themselves. How might I be myself? For people who identify as Muslim, how might I be Muslim? And then when you kind of work in anything being intersectional, how might I be a Muslim Canadian? We can even dive down a layer deeper, which is how might I be a Muslim who happens to reside on these Indigenous lands? Because, of course, being Canadian is a fairly recent notion of what it is to be Canadian here. Mm-hmm. But this is something that my wife and I have been exploring through the documentary film that we made, through doing lots of community engagement around Canada and even outside Canada. How might I be a Muslim Canadian? When I kind of boil that down, a lot of it is like, how can I just be myself as a human, as I navigate all kinds of things that humans navigate as they grow through their life. So that's kind of where I'm landing to right about now.
And maybe you can tell folks a bit about your documentary and what inspired you to make that?
Yeah, so it was actually shortly after the Trump election in the US. And I started to see a few interesting things happen, and some were very concerning. A rising sentiment of racism in what I could see in like small little groups in Newfoundland and Labrador. And of course, like across Canada as well. I mean, Canada's not too far off from the US, and we have our own unique takes on racism as well in Canada. And then there's also something else that I would see. It's a disconnect that I would probably call, some people might call it like the rural-urban divide, that people would automatically assume if you come from a rural area that you're more likely to be racist, sexist, kind of all the isms, etc., being in a rural community. And when I kind of see the confluence of all these things, I kind of just took a step back and said, well, my life was different than all these portrayals that I would see out there being covered. And then one day when my wife was in her medical residency on a 26-hour call shift in the hospital, I decided to sit down on my laptop and just write my story of what was my life like. And the one thing I realized, and I kind of thought about this after I wrote the story, is one of my biggest driving factors is I did not want anyone else to tell my story for me. And that is something that many people, many communities face a lot. And I'll say, especially for Muslims in Canada, we face it all the time, where you have other people telling your story for you of who is a Muslim, what is a Muslim. And that creates portrayals of what a Muslim Canadian is in the broader society. And I just didn't want that to happen. I was like, you know what? I'm just going to tell my own story of being a Muslim Newfoundlander. When I jumped on Google and just typed in the word Muslim Newfoundlander, I actually didn't find a whole lot. Like, I found things in general about the Muslim community here and there, but I couldn't really find something that put you in the shoes of a Muslim Newfoundlander. So I kind of just said, well, why not just tell my story? And it actually was a lot of fun to tell it, just kind of going down, putting down all my memories. It's kind of going through my own personal anthology. It was a lot of fun. I kind of went into like pages upon pages upon pages of notes before kind of forming it into a story.
Yeah. Well, and when I watched it, I mean, and I've been to Newfoundland many times, and it is a beautiful place. One of my takeaways was the sense of belonging that you felt, and the sense of acceptance, and the sense of social change that you'd like to create. I'm wondering, for you, what do you think makes this a polarizing conversation or a polarizing topic?
I think, kind of like what I was saying before, in many cases, there can be a lot of presumptions of what someone is. There can sometimes be presumptions even of their experience of what they go through, before even hearing from what they actually went through. And that was kind of like my story growing up in Newfoundland. Like, it's kind of funny. Like, when I would go tell typically other immigrants, people of color, Muslims, outside of Newfoundland in kind of like the bigger cities like Toronto or Vancouver, whatever have you. And I say I grew up in Newfoundland, everyone kind of looked at me a bit strange. They're like, ooh, that must have been like tough growing up in Newfoundland. I was like, no, not really. Like, it was actually really wonderful to grow up in Newfoundland. And then I really started to tease that out. It's like, well, there's a presumption of what it was like to grow up there. That presumption can actually lead to lots of life decisions that you make. So, for example, lots of newcomers might not necessarily feel that like going to Newfoundland makes sense for them. And when I wrote my story about growing up in Newfoundland, there was this other factor of, like, what people thought about rural Canada. And I mean, the town that I grew up in was about 5,000 people. So in some cases, I would say a medium-sized town for Newfoundland standards, yes. Very rural for everyone else's standards.
Yeah, there you go.
We had a McDonald's, a Walmart, and a traffic light, so we're a booming metropolis. But it was interesting in that the polarizing piece is the presumptions of people's lived experience, how that affects how you portray them, and sometimes how that even defines identities in our society. And the idea, and this is something that my wife and I, when we did our film tour, we used to do lots of talks in schools and communities. And the thing that we advocated the most for is for people just to own their own stories and tell their stories. I always say, aside from Salaam B'y being, I really love the title. And the reason I love the title is because, of course, Salaam means peace. It's a greeting for Muslims. But B'y actually has a double meaning. So, of course, B'y in Newfoundland, anyone from Newfoundland and Labrador know what B'y means. Kind of like a colloquial term for buddy. But also for me being Pakistani, my wife being Bangladeshi, B'y actually means brother in both of our native languages. So it kind of has this double meaning of salam, brother. But my other favorite word in the entire title is the letter A. It's just a story of a Muslim Newfoundlander. And that is something that when we went around Canada, we were just saying, you know what? Tell your own stories. Put your stories out there, and just be authentic to your stories of what that is. Otherwise, in many cases, you can get other people telling your stories for you. And then for me, being kind of like the social policy nut, is that ends up informing what broader society thinks of communities. It ends up informing what social policies, whether informal or informal, are that affect those communities. So those are some of the reasons behind it.
Yeah, well, and I'd like to explore that thread a little bit about, sharing one story as it can relate to policy. And one thing that we talked about was the fact that recently Canada appointed the first special representative on combating Islamophobia, Amira El-Gawabi. And I'm wondering, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that appointment and what it could mean more broadly for us in a Canadian context.
Amira El-Gawabi is a really amazing person. So she's a friend of mine. I've known her for a long time, and I wasn't aware that I kind of knew about the appointment process, but when I saw that she was appointed, I think me and a lot of people, both in the Muslim and non-Muslim community, were very happy because we knew that she's like an authentic person. She's deeply connected into not just the Muslim community, but in many communities. And I would also say it's a very difficult job to be in. I always say, like, I work in philanthropy right now. And in philanthropy, some people might call it the third sector. It kind of operates in not necessarily how government works, not necessarily how the private sector works. Some people call it the community sector or what have you. Her position, and just that position being a government-based position, is very important, but I find it to be very difficult. Because in many cases, the issues around Islamophobia that you're dealing with, you also have to deal with the nature of issues and how government has to engage with them. So, for example, when you are advocating on behalf of marginalized communities and you're in a position that the dominant majority has particular power over how that position works, it's a very tough position to be in. Like doing things for marginalized groups, operating within an organization that is also accountable to the dominant majority, you have to be an amazing connector. You have to have loads of empathy. You have to have loads of resilience. So I think the role is both very important, but I also acknowledge it for being a very difficult role.
Yeah. Well, and what, as we think about the fact that this happened, like that this appointment was important enough as a government priority to happen, to occur, and the opportunity that it paves the way for, what are your hopes for it?
I'm hoping it's like an appreciation, kind of going back to those, like the authentic stories. I remember years ago when people in the Canadian government were even scared to identify the word Islamophobia as a legitimate word. And that was not too long ago. There were MPs that were getting threats for even saying the word Islamophobia within the government. And then now, so actually my wife and I, both of us do anti-racism work in various lenses, herself as a health physician. We attended, we called it the National Day of Advocacy Against Islamophobia, where basically, was it last June, we went and we met with lots of MPs and other folks to talk about Islamophobia. And it was the anniversary of the London attack, which you may recall of the person in the van who ended up killing and destroying an entire family. And it was really amazing to see everyone from every party across all aisles actually addressing Islamophobia in the House. And to kind of come from a zone where years ago people couldn't even say the word, to now they're actually identifying it openly and saying that this is something important that we at least need to look at, that was very meaningful for me. I mean, of course, things like, we always say things don't move as fast as we want them to move, but I have to appreciate at the moments when they move. So it was very good to see that. And it just shows that, okay, these are things that people in our communities, we know they exist. Like, it's nothing new for us. But when you see the broader society, which government is supposed to be representative of broader society and how Canada wants to move forward, is starting to identify it and then starting to make actions, even though the actions could be difficult and tricky and etc. But it's actually starting to make moves. It does make you feel hopeful and optimistic.
Mm-hmm. What do you think was behind the fear of the word Islamophobia?
Ooh, that's an interesting one. There's probably a few elements inside of this. Islam, like many other religions, is intersectional with so many other factors. It's intersectional with culture, with class, with many other things, with race, with many things. So I think the intersectional nature of it made it a tricky thing for people to engage. They're like, what exactly is it that we're talking about right now? Are we talking about Islamophobia as Islam, the faith, and Muslims, people who practice a particular faith? Or are we talking about, and I think this is where like people, and I'm guessing, this is what people might push back on using the word Islamophobia. It's like, oh no, we're actually not talking about the faith, we're talking about cultural elements. But again, those cultural elements kind of still enable racism that people work within. So I'm just guessing those are some of the ways. It's like people would tease out these intersections and say, well, I'm actually talking about this intersection, not that. Or alternatively, I mean, people would just be very, very critical and in some cases harmful and abusive towards Muslims, which we saw there's be quite rampant after 9/11, both in the US and in Canada. So kind of like the post 9/11 world. And Islamophobia existed before 9/11, but then 9/11 really, really amplified it. And I think for numerous reasons. It's been something that is connected into politics, into culture, into so many facets of decision making. But I'm and it's kind of like living as being a Muslim in Canada. You're just out there trying to live your life, mind your own business, and be a part of your community. And that kind of those macro level things very much affected you at a micro level. They affected how you're treated in your community, in society. And I think that's kind of what we've witnessed over the past 20 years in different ways.
Mm-hmm. I have two questions. The first is, relating back to what you said about the importance of sharing an individual story, which I think is important. In some ways, I think that's how we learn and reduce polarization, because we're finding common ground. Your story is different than mine, but as you say, we're both trying to find our way in the world and contribute and live a life that is meaningful both to us and in community. And as it relates to your own personal story of, maybe it's like before and after 9/11, you mentioned these micro or macro ways that it changed your lived experience. Could you help us understand what that meant for you?
I think that's one of the most fascinating things about being in Newfoundland is I realized it after the fact. I remember when 9/11 happened, it was my first week in university. So here I was growing up in Clanville, moving to St. John's, living in residence, first week of university, like any university kid, just trying to make your way and figure things out. And I recall walking past, I remember I lived on the first floor of my dorm at that time, and I happened to always have to walk past the TV room when I used to walk to class to exit my dorm. As I was walking past the TV room, I saw a bunch of people gathered inside of there. And then I walk in and I see one of the buildings of the World Trade Center on fire. And then I see the next plane go into another building. And then when I'm there, I'm just like, for me, I don't think I really absorbed the gravity of the situation, to be honest. I was just like, okay, like, I kind of had to mentally disconnect, be like, oh my God, I'm going to be late for class. I have to make it to my class. I don't know how to get there because I haven't navigated like the tunnels and things at Memorial University to walk through to find my class. And I kind of go off to class. And it's interesting because what happened to me was revolutionary in the fact that nothing happened to me. And that was the thing that was interesting, because after that moment, Muslims in the US and Canada almost instantly started to see society treat them differently. People looking in their direction, people blaming them for things that they have absolutely nothing to do with, to levels of like abuse that they would have to deal with. And there I was in Newfoundland. I just got to live my life as a normal first year university student, bumbling around campus trying to figure my way out. And that in itself was a privilege, that I just got to be a normal student. I just got to live my life at the same time being a practicing Muslim, and it didn't have any effect on me. And I only realized it till after the fact. I'm like, I was kind of in a bubble in Newfoundland where I didn't really have to deal with this kind of Islamophobia. And the funny thing was, in Newfoundland, I always say if I would be out and if anyone were to engage me in a racist action, I would typically have to hold back other people from jumping that person who's engaging me in a racist way, because so many people just I was friends with, and they'd just be very supportive of me, and it was not really an issue that I had to deal with in university. And I think that was a very, very unique experience for me to live in a post 9/11 world.
Yeah. I just have one question I'd like to tease out from that. As you mentioned, your friends who acted as allies for you, help us understand what that means, or the importance of allyship, like what that looks like on a tangible, daily, small action basis.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, to give you an example, like, I'm someone in high school and in university, and to this day, like, never drank or did drugs. Drinking was prevalent in Newfoundland, especially in university life.
On George Street, I'm sure.
Of course.
Yeah.
And then but the funny thing was, I love to dance. So I would go to clubs all the time to go dance with my friends, and I would never be drinking. And it's something that, well, most of the times I was designated driver for a lot of people. But just like small examples, like, and it's just like small bits of kindness. Like, I would rarely ever have to pay for a soda if I was ever at a bar in Newfoundland. And sometimes it'd just be strangers that would just pay for it for me, because they just see me go up, I'll get like a soda, and many times someone else would grab it for me. I didn't ask them to do it, they just do it. And it'd be very rare that anyone would say, actually very rare to negligible, that anyone would say anything about me practice Islam. I get questions about it, and I appreciated the questions, because it's just people who just want to learn. But the reason I appreciated the questions is because I knew where it's coming from. Many times they'd ask me a question so that they can take the answer to figure out how to be more inclusive of me. So they might ask me, oh, why don't you eat this? Why don't you do that? But then they'd probably invite me over to their parents' house for dinner one day, and they'd actually have like food that I could eat, essentially, at that meal. So sometimes, I mean, other people might get sensitive to these kinds of questions, but I knew the intentions of why they're asking it. They're asking it so that they could learn to then be inclusive of me. So that was something really nice. The other thing I joke around about is, like, my friends, when I'd be fasting during Ramadan, and it's time for me to break my fast, like, it'd be almost like a community feel where kind of like, as a collective, we'd go out for a meal. So I would always say in Newfoundland, I grew up in a Muslim community being surrounded by non-Muslims, because they actually empowered and enabled me to be my own Muslim.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, that is, I love that. And one of the questions I have for you is, like, how much of this is your own lens in creating this positive world of people that are interacting with you in such a positive way, and how much of that is other people approaching you in that way? If you need me to elaborate on that, just let me know.
I think I kind of get it. And I think most people notice about me, I'm kind of like a relentless optimist. And I'm always just trying to like, I engage people. I engage people in the ways that I like as well. Um, so I'm the kind of person who has a strong sense of self. I know who I am. I don't necessarily succumb to peer pressure in a particular way. And because of that, I just live my own identity. If people are doing things that I don't want to be a part of, I'm just not a part of it. And if they ask me questions about it, I'm happy to navigate it. And like I said, I don't necessarily get to like the questions don't affect me because I'm just like I'm fine with my decisions. So I think maybe because of that, it allows me to navigate these diverse circles where people might not know too much about me and they might ask questions about me. And I kind of treat it as I don't know, I kind of like it. It's kind of nice. Um, I remember actually this was years later after leaving Newfoundland. I was hanging out with a friend of mine who I was visiting Montreal and I stayed at his place for a night and he was having a house party. And I remember at one point we were just started chatting and I have no idea how it happened, but all of a sudden, his friends just got into this big conversation about like life and purpose and all these things. And when I went to the kitchen and my friend just looked at me, he's like, I've never seen these people talk about this stuff in this way. He's like, I have no idea what you did that got them. I was like, I didn't do anything. I got no idea what I did, but they just like started talking about this stuff. And I think it was more of a, when I had a sense of self and my own identity and how I navigate the world, that kind of allows me to navigate it in a way that makes sense for me.
Yeah, I like that. And gosh, I think there's a lot there, right? It's like, how do you remain or how do you become grounded in your own identity and what and who you are and why? And then how do you remain curious about others and invite them in? And I think that that's a practice that many people are learning, and that I think it's a journey for all of us, for probably our whole lives. And having said that, what tips or thoughts do you have for people as they continue to become grounded in who they are and trying to create this common ground and curiosity about the journey of others?
I think kindness goes a long way. And when I say that, it's both being kind to yourself and being kind to others, and also realizing, and like kindness, and like a big piece is empathy. Um, so as I'm kind of navigating this world, and I'm a very, I guess you might call it curious person in the sense that I engage with lots of different groups. So the joke used to be I'm the kind of person that I would be friends with different circles of people, but whenever I'd host a party, I wouldn't like segment it. I just have one big party and all those circles will come together. And they
Yes, I
say
like that.
this is the time where we would never really engage with all these different types of people, but like I kind of bring them together. Um, and I think a lot of it is like the kindness piece. Is you're kind to those people around you, and I feel like that goes a long way. But you also have to be kind to yourself. You have to realize that there's gonna be some people when you can hit certain points where they just doesn't fit you anymore to be around, and that's fine too. To exit relationships in that way as well. Um, so I don't really know if that's a good answer, but that's just the thing that comes to mind.
Well, and I heard you say too, like, how do you don't see people in groups, but people as people, and how do you create that welcoming community? Um, as you think about helping in your own small or large way reduce, let's call it Islamophobia across Canada, um, like anything where people are afraid, it sometimes I think comes down to a lack of understanding of what it means. What 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 ways would you encourage non-Muslims to create a more welcoming space or culture, community for people who are practicing the faith.
I heard a good quote. I think it might have been from Trevor Noah, where he said, "Racism doesn't stand well to contact." So
Yeah.
it's almost like when you actually engage people and you get to get that human relationship with them, that's when minds really start to change. And I know there's a big push around education and knowledge being a part of the solution, but to be completely honest, I think it's more rooted in kind of like compassion and kindness,
Yeah.
where I might not know all the details and have all the knowledge of who or how someone is, but if you can engage them with kindness and compassion, it kind of doesn't really matter about you knowing like I don't need someone to know the details about Ramadan. If someone doesn't know that I fast 30 days from sunrise to sunset and that I can't drink water, like that doesn't offend me. I kind of like you always meet everyone where they're at. And you kind of see like how their compassion and kindness stretches. So, for example, if I meet someone who doesn't know what Ramadan is, who might ask, and we always kind of joke around in the Muslim community about like the silly questions about like, oh, not even water during the day. But like, if someone asks that question and they're curious, I find it charming and fun. But then if they try to project certain assertions onto it and be like, oh well, you shouldn't be doing this, you shouldn't be doing that. I'm like, okay, well that just shows me like the stress test or the extent of your kindness and compassion. So like I kind of look at the journey that everyone is on, including myself, rather than do they have like the check boxes filled out of like knowledge or education on specific issue areas.
Yeah, it's kind of what I'm hearing you say there potentially is, acknowledging that we're all on a journey, and none of us know everything about every other culture or religion or way of being, and all that we can do is bring kindness and compassion to that. Final question for you. So it relates to one of the points that you made at the beginning, which is this intersectional Canada that we're living in, that we're creating, and we're in Ramadan right now. We're approaching Easter, which is a Christian holiday, and then all of that in the context of reconciling with Indigenous communities in Canada. What thoughts do you have about how we can create this most inclusive Canada in light of all of these different ways of being?
Yeah, so maybe first I'll start from the Islamic angle. And like there's roots in the Quran that specifically says that you're supposed to acknowledge when you're a treaty person and being part of a treaty when you're moving to a new land or wherever you might live. So a lot of the things, and again, kind of when we talk about reconciliation of acknowledging ourselves, like where we happen to live on treaty lands, there's of course lands that don't have a treaty associated to them, but where we happen to live on treaty lands as a Muslim, to acknowledge that Islamically you're obligated to care about being a treaty person. Like that's like in your faith to do so. And that in itself makes a journey to understand, well, what does that really mean? And I remember, like, even when we created Salaam B'y, a story of a Muslim Newfoundlander, I was living in Calgary at the time, and I started thinking, I was like, oh, well, what does it mean to be a Muslim Canadian? And I was like, well, what does it mean to be a Muslim of the Blackfoot Confederacy? Like, what does that really mean? Because the framework or the notion of what we even define as Canadian, I was curious as to like, oh, well, what does it mean to be a Muslim of Blackfoot Confederacy? What does it mean to be a Muslim treaty person? So I think from an Islamic angle, that's kind of the conversation that I have with other Muslims, being like, this is in our faith, that like our faith is meant to be practical in these senses of like, if you're a treaty person, you have to be very aware and fall into like understand the obligations of being a treaty person. When it comes to more broadly of kind of what it is to be a Muslim Canadian, I think it's the usual thing of actually, it's also Islamically, you're supposed to care for those. It kind of, the way that the kind of the strata of care works is kind of like you yourself, your family, your household, your neighbor, your community, and it kind of goes out from there. So we are also obligated to care about all people in our community here. From an intersectional lens, interesting, because many Muslims are newcomers to Canada. So their definition of community and home could be both in Brampton and then also in Pakistan. So what does that mean? And where do you apply your energy and effort to? So it's a constant thing, but I think at the end of it, we kind of realize it's actually a really wonderful journey to be on. To, like, if your whole goal is to build up relationships with people, like, it's really fun. It's really fun. It's really rewarding. It's really fulfilling. It's not intimidating, because once you actually go and engage people, you realize that people are like just beautiful. And like I said, isms don't stand up well to sustained contact and sincere relationships. So building up sincere relationships with everyone around you, it really yields something beautiful.
Yeah, I love that. And a plus one on Trevor Noah. I read his biography last year, and it was fantastic. He's so charming.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of intersectional identities at play with him too, for sure. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. As we close this conversation, what's your takeaway, or what thought would you like to leave people with?
I'll kind of leave someone so with a hadith, and a hadith in Islam is a saying of the Prophet. So basically, the hadith is be kind, for whenever kindness becomes a part of something, it beautifies it.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for this conversation.
Thanks, Vanessa.
Thank you so much for joining me for today's polarizing conversation. Much gratitude to Inspiring Communities for supporting season 1 of this podcast series. If you like this episode, please share it and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you missed the other episodes, check us out at www.polarizingconversations.com and let me know what you think. We have some exciting polarizing conversations coming up in the rest of the season, so I sincerely hope you'll join us for those. Looking forward to it, and please let us know what you think.